Kia ora everybody and welcome back to Humankind. Today we're going through, is Humankind a Civ clone? And I'm going to offer you 5 reasons why I think Humankind is much, much more than a Civ clone. We won't be dwelling on the fact that it has money instead of gold or industry instead of production, but rather wider points. I'm also not going to dwell on some things that I've already covered in detail on the channel. We're going to take a little bit more of an abstract, step back look at what Humankind offers. First and foremost, I think we have to acknowledge that Humankind differs greatly from Civilization 5 and 6 in that Humankind is about the collective experience, not the individual. And this might sound a little bit airy-fairy or philosophical, but bear with me, we will discuss gameplay as well. But I think that Humankind is all about the collective. There are no great people. You do not have a specific leader. Even when you choose a culture, say England or America, the Egyptians, you're not given a certain leader. You are, of course, playing as a detached leader from the civilization, which is customizable, right? You can create your own avatar and leader, and we believe unlock more things for them as you achieve certain things throughout Humankind and throughout your time playing the game. So you have this detached leader who is not assigned to history. We don't have great people. Yes, we have historical accuracy in terms of cultures and the names of units, but otherwise, Humankind is about a collective experience. It's about the gameplay. It's about your journey and helping develop, grow, and change Humankind rather than being prescribed and strictly bound to historical figures and historical accuracy in that regard. And I think that gives Humankind a great deal of flexibility, not only for the player, but also for the developers in what they can do, what they can add, and how they can really flesh out, say, the detached, customizable leader abilities, and so on and so forth. This ties me quite well into my next point, which is about the map being divided into regions. Okay, in Humankind, the world plays out very differently. So, as you may already know, you start with your unit, you can hunt down animals to have some more units. You're in the nomadic culture, so you're roaming around without a city. Eventually, you can place down an outpost in a pre-prescribed area on the map, roughly, say, 40 tiles in size, right? Ballpark figure, around 40 tiles. You can place an outpost, that outpost can turn into a city. However, these regions do something really great for the game that sets it apart from Civilization and ensures it's not just a Civ clone. And that is that when you place down your city, firstly, you can move it around using a city action, you can move it and replace it, but more importantly, when you have a city or an outpost in a region, you're actually claiming the whole region. So you don't need to settle your city within, say, 3 tiles of the dyes, or 3 tiles of that copper resource down the bottom right there. You don't have to do that. So long as you claim the region with at least an outpost or a city, you have access to everything within that region. I think not only is that more realistic to real life, but it's much more flexible and will offer a lot more opportunity for us as players to grow our civilization and to grow Humankind in a way that's much more natural. I've touched on this once before, but I think it's a good anecdote. You don't have to go and settle a city next to some oil right down the bottom of the map because you don't have any in your empire. If you claim that territory, you'll have access to that oil and fertile land for farming. Or you'll have access to that oil and these mountains, this entire mountain range, or whatever it might be. The regionality is key. Thirdly, I think building on that is the terrain, okay? The terrain in Humankind allows lots of things. Firstly, it allows for a more complex and interesting combat system, which I'll cover next. Secondly, the layered levels on the terrain give the game itself just more interest than Civilization. In Civilization, we have flatland and mountains, and then the hills in between, and that's kind of it, and sometimes it's snowy and sometimes it's not, but that's sort of it. In Humankind, there really are lots of layers. You can feel the land. You can really feel the difficulty, especially if you're trying to navigate a unit. Hills and mountains and cliff faces really actually matter in this game. Finally, on the terrain, I would say that because the terrain is different and more complicated and there are more layers to it, it enables the cultures within the game, right, these civilizations that we play as, to have more map-specific benefits. And yes, absolutely, we already have that in Civilization, right? If you're playing as the Russians, you don't mind the snow. Or, likewise, if you're playing as Canada in Civ 6, in fact, you quite like the snow. But outside of that, there aren't really too many engagements with the map itself beyond a very fixed focus, i.e. this one tile has a river near it, so I'll build a farm on this one tile, right? It can be, and I don't mean to take away from Civ, I love Civ, but it can be quite prescribed and fixed in that way. In Humankind, when you choose a culture, right, so you're moving through an era, you're choosing another culture, you may have found that your first culture was great for you in the early game because you were fighting people, but now that you move through, say, into the mid-game, you've settled some extra land, you've taken some extra territories, all of a sudden, for example, you might realize, wow, actually, now I have all of this land and there are lots of rivers, right? Because you may have captured, say, 2 or 3 different regions that are filled with rivers. And now you can upgrade or transcend into a new culture that has something specifically targeted about rivers. And these do exist. These do definitely exist. It may be that you get +2 food for every single river tile in your empire. And that didn't appeal to you at the start, but it really appeals to you now. And I think that's one anecdote, right? One small trivial example of a much wider system at play. And a really interesting engagement between cultures and the terrain. And the complexity, I think, will help set Humankind apart from Civ and ensure that this is not just a Civ clone. As I said, next up, it's combat. And really, I think you would struggle to argue that Humankind's combat is a Civ clone. It just right from the word get-go, just from looking at it, you can tell it isn't. So, in Humankind, combat battles are sort of turn-based. Not turn-based as in-game turns, right? Where you end your turn, move to the next one, it skips ahead a year or 1,000 years or whatever it is. But actually, the actual combat itself sort of has turns or rounds, might be another way of thinking about it. It's 3 rounds, right? So it's turn-based, 3 rounds. An aggressor must try to either take a central point, a focal point, maybe it's a city or an outpost or whatever, or wipe out the defenders. And the defenders must try and defend that central point throughout the battle. You can choose where you want your units to spawn. There's some tactics around where you want to place them, i.e. where do you want them to come into the battle, right? You can think about flanking or holding a position. There's lots more complexity to it. It's a more intricate, detailed combat system. Now, Civ does have multipliers as well, right? If you're on a hill, you have a terrain multiplier that may be positive, and if you're in a forest, it's a negative one. So, terrain multipliers aren't new, indeed, not just to Civ and Humankind, but to the franchise gaming as a whole. But what Humankind does really well with its combat is adds a lot more nuance, a lot more layers, and I'm tempted to say difficulty or complexity, but I don't want to give you the wrong impression. It's not that it's too hard, it's just that you have more choices. You can auto-resolve the battle, in which case it'll be just like a fight in Civ, right? Unit versus unit, auto-resolved. Or it could be 5 units versus 5 units auto-resolved. But you can also manually do it, where you can do some of those things that I just talked about before, with where you want to place your units, and figuring out unit attrition and movement, and trying to sort of ensure that enemy units can't retreat, right? So you might sort of pin them in and try and push them in towards some cliff faces, for example, so they can't run. There's lots more intricacy to the combat system, and I think that really sets it apart from Civilization. And last but not least, and to sort of tie all of this together, I should say that overall, the culture, era, and fame system, which I have covered separately, and if you'd like more of an analytical review, you can check that out on the channel, where I sort of explain it and talk through it as more of a guide. But in this video, I'm sort of stepping back and thinking about it more as a concept, philosophically, if you like, rather than analytically. I think that the way that we not only get to choose a different culture within each of the 6 eras, and this makes it both more flexible and potentially more enjoyable, but then how that relates to fame and that you can sort of win the game without just having to race to space or just having to buy all the city-states, right? You're actually rewarded for doing things that make you famous. You're rewarded for winning lots of battles in one era, and then the next era you could be awarded for claiming lots of land. Or perhaps the next era you're awarded for researching, 20 technologies in an era. Incredible. And then something might change completely in the geopolitical situation, and in the fourth era, you're back to earning fame from slaying enemy units. The fame system and the way it interacts with culture and eras allows for a really dynamic, flexible, and interesting game, building on all of the other things that I've already talked about, like terrain, like the combat system, like the way that the map is divided, and brings together a picture for humankind that is most definitely distinct from civilization. Now, how will we see this play out? Humankind is in a tricky spot, because unlike Civ, it is not a well-established franchise. Now, Amplitude Studios do have games like Endless Legend and Endless Space, which have similar mechanics to Humankind and feel similar. So there is a little bit of a history and a little bit of a legacy, but not in this space, not in the sort of pseudo-historical accurate simulation strategy space. They haven't released the title here, so they'll be starting on a back foot. However, I think so far, from what we've played, seen, and heard of Humankind, and from my own experience playing the game, I think this is definitely not a Civilization clone. I think this game will stand alone as a unique and interesting title. Thank you very much for joining me today in this sort of video essay, reflective commentary on Humankind. If you did enjoy it, I'd love a like rating, and why not subscribe and join our small growing community. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.